Good evening, and welcome to the fourth in our lecture series on the Dead Sea Scrolls, in conjunction with the exhibition of the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Science Museum of Minnesota. I'm Dr. Mark Schuler. I'm the chairperson of the Department of Religion and Theology, and I'm also co-director of the Hippos Susita archaeological excavations in Israel. And it's my privilege to do the lecture this evening on Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I will talk for a period of time. There will be time for questions, and our goal is to be finished around 8:30 this evening. Two requests before we start. Those of you who are in my New Testament class and hoping to get extra credit for being here, make sure that you check in with me that I do have your name on the list when the lecture is over so that you can get that credit. And then for all of you, if you do have a cell phone and would kindly silence the ring, that will mean a little, somewhat fewer interruptions during our presentation this evening. So again, welcome as we begin tonight. Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. In tonight's discussion, I hope to talk about the following points. First of all, since this is the final lecture in our series, I want to review a bit of what we have covered, leading up to a clarification of the assumptions that I use when I approach the scrolls. Then I'm going to be making my primary thesis for the evening, and that is the Dead Sea Scrolls are important for understanding Jesus because they help us understand the Jewish religious context in which Jesus lived. So we'll talk about, first of all, similarities and then differences between Jesus, his speaking, and those who wrote about Jesus, and some of the things we see in some of the scrolls. And then I'll summarize with a more detailed statement of the value of the scrolls for understanding Jesus and the movement that grew up around him. So first of all, some assumptions. As you recall from previous lectures or your knowledge of the topic, what we typically call the Dead Sea Scrolls were recovered in 11 caves in and around Khirbet Qumran on the northwest side of the Dead Sea. We've talked previously about their initial discovery by some Bedouin in 1946 and the rather convoluted route through which 7 of the scrolls eventually came to be controlled, 3 of them by Sukenik and then the other 4 by Yigal Yadin, and are now in the Israeli museum. These scrolls include hymn documents, they include war documents, they include texts from the Bible, such as the great Isaiah scroll. They include peshers on various Old Testament prophetic writings where the text of a writing is applied to a contemporary context. And then they include specific sectarian documents that may allude to a community or communities. Even some stories that we've never heard of about biblical characters show up in some of these scrolls. We also have talked about the site near which the scrolls have been discovered, Khirbet Qumran, which was excavated by Roland Deveau and the École Biblique, and the theory that it was a monastic community from which the scrolls came. So we have taken a look at what a reconstruction of the site might be like, with a large fortified building to the east and a separate building to the west. My computer's being a little stubborn here. They can be that way, can't they? This never happens in class, does it? We've spoken about the tower, the fortified tower that guarded the entrance to the site, a room that has been identified potentially as the place where meals were held, primarily because next to it is a small room in which was discovered a large collection of pottery, some 1,000 pieces, perhaps the pantry. We have spoken about this particular location where some inkwells were found and where, according to DeVoe's theory, scrolls were copied. We have, though, also noted that there are many other interpretations of the archaeological site, that perhaps it was a fortified manor house or a pottery facility or some kind of fortress. So there is no uniform perspective on the site. Nearby is this cemetery, we've mentioned that as well previously, in which there are over 1,000 tombs oriented north and south. Of the some 50 that have been excavated, more than half are males. Most of the small number of tombs that are east-west are female. And of course the debate is this the cemetery for a Qumran community, or is it a regional cemetery? And we've talked about that previously. So where do I come down on all of this? Because how one frames the data influences how one interprets it. I think it's better to talk about the Dead Sea scraps than to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll speak later that 931 documents have been identified. Only about 12 of them are complete scrolls. In cave number 1, where scrolls were found in some of these jars, only a couple of jars had scrolls. Most of the jars were empty. I think it is fair to surmise that there were many, many, many more documents in the caves than survived till 1946. And we have the scraps that are remaining. There are two basic theories about what these documents that are in the caves, as Michael Wise calls it, the scribbling scribes theory, that is that they were all written and copied at Khirbet Qumran. The problem with that is they are almost all in a different hand. Only 15 documents share the same hand with another document. That's way too much divergence. So I hold the theory that what we find in the caves represent multiple libraries from multiple sources, that in the last days of the Jewish revolt, as the Roman victory was evident, people fled from populated regions, Jerusalem, Jericho, elsewhere, to the remotest place they could go in the land, the area near the Dead Sea, and hid their valuables, their scrolls, in whatever cave they could find. And there is no cohesiveness to this collection. As to Khirbet Qumran, if it is a sectarian outpost, it's not a mother house. It may have been sort of the remote place, perhaps for a sectarian community, although a lot of pottery seems to have been made there. And we don't have evidence of residential quarters to hold a large community. The cemetery, I've come to believe, is most likely a regional cemetery like Khirbet Karzon on the other side of the Dead Sea, and is not related to the community. When Josephus talks about the Essenes near the Dead Sea, he's probably using that term broadly and generically for a range of holiness groups that went to the wilderness rather than one particular group at one particular site. So with that perspective in mind, we then turn to the Jesus movement, the Jewish religious world, and what these scraps tell us about the religious world of the late Second Temple period. When I teach New Testament, I talk about 6 characteristics being in common among the various Jewish groups that made up Jewish religion in the time of Jesus up until the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 AD, namely the Torah, monotheism, the temple, the synagogue, the festival cycle, and purity. By examining each of these topics, comparing the New Testament to the fragments we have in the scrolls, we can see some similarities and some differences. So let's take each topic in turn. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, were the law, the story. It's that which identified and gave identity to the Jewish people. It was a motif for life, and it was central for all these groups. Forming layers about it were the writings of the prophets, the other writings of what we call the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, but then also interpretations, targums, and an oral tradition, the tradition of the elders advocated by the Pharisees. Some of this later oral tradition would eventually be written down in the Mishnah and the Talmud, but at the center of it all was the Torah. When we look at the 931 scrolls or scroll fragments that have been identified from the caves, you see that 212 of them are from the Hebrew Bible. And when we look even more closely at those for which there are multiple copies, you will see that 2 books of the Torah, Deuteronomy and Genesis, are among the top 4 texts for which we have multiple copies in the scrolls found in the caves near Khirbet Qumran. So clearly, the Torah was important in Jewish religion in the late Second Temple period. The Temple Scroll is a particular example of this. The Temple Scroll talks about the construction of a glorious temple someday, almost like the descriptions we have in Ezekiel. First some description, then some of the festivals and sacrifices, and then a second section. There are laws of purity for the temple and the city that surrounds it. Interestingly, it amounts to a rewrite of Deuteronomy 12 to 23, but the material is reorganized as if one were starting in the Holy of Holies and working your way out. And so we have this rather elaborate temple structure and city all laid out as you see in the diagram here. What's particularly interesting, though, is a shift that occurs in the Temple Scroll. Whereas Deuteronomy is in the third person, the Lord says, the Temple Scroll is written in the first person, as if the Lord himself were speaking. So, my temple, my city, I say. It's a divine word from the mouth of God, a new Torah, an authoritative interpretation. This becomes quite interesting when we compare that movement to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about not one piece of the Torah passing away. When he turns to his cases, he starts with, "You have heard that it was said of old, 'You shall not murder.'" Those words come from the Torah. But then Jesus goes on, shifting to the first person, "But I say to you." You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you. And at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount, the comment is made that he spoke as one with authority. So we see a bit of a parallel here in the way that Jesus movement, Jesus himself, and at least the Temple Scroll dealt with pieces of material from Deuteronomy. As to the use of the prophets, the Pesher Habakkuk uses an interesting process. A verse will be quoted from Habakkuk, for the wicked man hems in the righteous man. And then the Pesher goes on to explain the wicked man refers to the wicked priest, and the righteous man is the teacher of righteousness. What the Pesher has done is to take this earlier prophecy and explain it in terms of the life of the community. Jesus, when he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." It's the same kind of move, taking a prophetic text and talking about its contemporary applicability. We see, in a way, how Jewish people worked with the prophets. A related theme, prophetic theme, but also related to Deuteronomy, is the theme of the covenant. And very much the Damascus document and the Serach Yahad, the rule of the community, talk about, at least the community behind these two documents, talk about entering into a renewed covenant. When he called to mind the covenant he had made with their fathers, he left a remnant for Israel. But God considered their deeds, that they sought him with a whole heart. So he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. And if you hear echoes of Jeremiah 31, you are correct. Also in the Damascus document, "But when those who were left held firm to the commandments of God, he instituted his covenant with Israel forever, revealing to them hidden things in which all Israel had gone wrong, his holy Sabbaths, his glorious festivals, his righteous laws, his reliable ways, which man should carry out and so have life in them." Similarly, in the Serach Yahad, "He will induct all who volunteer to live by the laws of God into the covenant of mercy, so as to be joined to God's society and walk faultless before him." So at least these documents recovered in the scroll reflect a sense that God is bringing about a renewed covenant, a new covenant with his people. All who enter the Yahad's rule shall be initiated into the covenant before God, agreeing to act according to all that he has commanded. Now let's turn to the Jesus movement. You will notice similar language, but a different kind of thrust. "And he did the same with the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood.'" Same language, but different thrust, brought about by Jesus, not by the action of the people. Paul writes, "In the same way he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" And in Hebrews, "For this reason he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, because a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions under the first covenant." Whereas the Damascus document and the Serach Yahad talk about a new covenant brought about by the faithful following of the law by members of the community, in the Jesus movement, a new covenant is also announced. But this is brought about by God's act of mercy in the death of Jesus Christ. Monotheism is a second characteristic of Second Temple Judaism. God alone is God, even in the polytheistic world that the Romans ruled, even when their temple was no more. We see monotheism in the scrolls. "You shall worship no other God, for your God is a jealous God," says the temple scroll. And God is identified as creator, loving one, just, God of gods, and the gods there are the angels, man of war in various scrolls. Similarly, in Jesus, he said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment." But taking a slightly different task, Jesus says, "The Father and I are one." A third characteristic of the Jewish religion of the late Second Temple period is a focus on the temple. This great structure, rebuilt by Herod the Great, made the largest sacred shrine in the ancient world, the center of Jewish religious and political life, a place of pilgrimage, a place of prayer. Interestingly, in the scrolls, you find anger about practices in the temple. They defile the sanctuary, for they do not separate clean from unclean, says the Damascus document. And a perspective that the community is a new temple. They, the Echad, are to atone for all those in Aaron who volunteer for holiness. Then shall the party of the Echad truly be established, an eternal planting, a temple for Israel, and a mystery, a holy of holies for Aaron. In the Jesus movement, we find Jesus angry with practices in the temple. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers." And in the Jesus movement, we see the community identified as the temple. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? In Him, the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord. Similar perspectives in these two groups within Jewish religion of the late Second Temple period. The synagogue was a central element of Jewish religion. Please don't think necessarily of a building, but rather an assembly of 10 men. Could be a place in a private house or a public building, although later we do find some synagogues built, such as this one at Gamla, which would be reconstructed, something like this. And earlier this year, the Israel Antiquities Authority identified this building as the oldest synagogue in Israel at Magdala. They claim it came into existence as early as 50 BC. If it is indeed a synagogue, it has a stone here, you see the menorah on there. If it is indeed a synagogue there on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, very likely Jesus attended synagogue there, or maybe even taught there. But when we turn to the scrolls, there is no such structure mentioned, a synagogue. However, there is one very interesting room in the ruins at Khirbet Qumran. This particular room, it's right next to the room that's been identified as a scriptorium. I'm not sure it was, but you'll notice that there are benches around the end, like other synagogues had. Perhaps it's an early form. But in the scrolls, at least the Zerach Yechad, community gatherings are central. They shall eat, pray, and deliberate communally. Whenever 10 men, notice the same requirement, belonging to the party of the Echad, sorry for the the spelling error there, are gathered, a priest must also be present. This procedure shall govern every meal, provided at least 10 men are gathered together. Jesus taught in synagogues. We have stories about him doing so in the New Testament. We know that early Christians gathered in homes, and that early Christians had a communal life, Acts 2. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts. Similarly, at least according to the Damascus document and the Zerach Yechad, communities represented by these two scrolls had things in common as well. But interestingly, within the Christian tradition, it's 2 or 3. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am among them. The festivals were the fifth characteristic of late Second Temple Judaism, including the weekly festival of the Sabbath from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, and then the major pilgrimage festivals, the annual festivals such as Passover, unleavened bread, the Feast of Weeks, Feast of Booths, Day of Atonement, and so forth. We see the festivals playing a significant role in some of the scrolls. from the temple scroll. And you shall offer sacrifices upon the altar of burnt offerings for all the Lord's festivals, on the Sabbaths, at the beginning of the months, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and on the day of the waving of the Omer, and on the feast of the second Passover, and on the Feast of Weeks, and on the Day of Atonement, and on the Feast of Booths. There was, in fact, among some of the documents that have been recovered from Ner Kirbet Qumran, a significant concern about calendar. And some scholars talk about calendar wars. This is a sundial that was discovered in the ruins at Kirbet Qumran. We find documents like 4Q Brontologion, which looks a little bizarre. You see reference to Sagittarius and Aquarius and Aries and Cancer, all these zodiac signs. But what's going on here is sort of a struggle between two different kinds of calendars. The lunar calendar, which seems to have been the calendar embraced by, it came to be embraced by the rabbinic tradition, so that would go back to the Pharisees and maybe the Sadducees. In a lunar calendar, each month has 29 to 30 days, and so if you do a series of months, you end up with a year that's 10 or 11 days short, so every 3 years you have to add another month for it to even out. But within some of the books that we find in the caves near Kirbet Qumran, the solar calendar seems to be the dominant one, going back to one variant reading of the story of the flood that has that whole cycle from Genesis 7 to Genesis 8 taking place in 1 year. Jubilees describes it this way. After the flood, they placed them on the heavenly tablets. Each had a calendar, each had 13 weeks. From one to another passed their memorial, from the first to the second to the third, and third to the fourth. All the days of the commandments will be 52 weeks of days, and these shall make an entire year. A solar calendar. In the scrolls, we have reference to David writing songs before the altar, 364 of them, one for each day of the year. That's a solar calendar. Among some of the scrolls, like 4Q319, the count of days begins on the fourth day, because you now have sun and moon for calendars. See? In fact, 317 addresses the whole issue of the phases of the moon and how the calendars relate. 4Q319 tries to merge solar calendars with lunar months and show how that works vis-a-vis Jubilees. So obviously, calendar issues were very important. 4QMMT suggests that the reason, at least those people represented by that scroll, withdrew from Jewish society was over the issue of calendars. Now, in the Jesus movement, we do see that festivals and observing them are important. Jesus goes to Jerusalem for the Passover multiple times in the Gospel of John. But Jesus has a very different perspective on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And we see the early Christian community very quickly abandoning the Sabbath and gathering on the first day of the week when we met to break bread. Paul was holding a discussion with them from Acts chapter 20. And Paul, in writing to the Colossians, says, "Therefore do not let anyone condemn you in matters of food, of drink, or of observing festivals, new moons, or Sabbaths." So the fight that apparently was going on among some in Second Temple Jewish religion was something the Jesus movement stepped away from and avoided. However, these kind of calendar differences can help us with a knotty little problem in the New Testament. Whereas the Synoptic Gospels put the crucifixion on the day after the Passover, in John chapter 19, it's on the day of the preparation for the Passover. At about the 6th hour, Pilate said to the Jews, "Here is your king," which sounds like Jesus is crucified on the day when the Passover lambs are sacrificed. Well, if there are multiple calendars being used in Jerusalem by different groups within the Jewish religious tradition, that could explain this kind of differential. Purity. According to the Tosefta, purity broke out among Israel in the Second Temple period. We see this archaeologically in the mikvaot, the ritual baths that we find, stone vessels, local pottery, and then the soreg, the wall that separated off the area of the court of the Gentiles from the rest of the temple precincts. These ritual baths are often stepped pools, relatively small, and they were used not for cleansing of dirt, but for cleansing of impurities that one could then engage in rituals again. What was so important for the members of the temple, the priests and the Levites, apparently was also becoming important for very pious Jews. Purity could be maintained best by the use of stone vessels because they were considered to be the kinds of vessels that did not transfer impurities. So we find them in Jewish areas archaeologically. And then, of course, purity is quite well indicated by this inscription from the Soreg. No foreigner is to go beyond the balustrade and the plaza of the temple zone. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his death, which will surely follow. So you see that within Second Temple Jewish religion, purity was an extremely important theme. Do we have this in the scrolls and at Khirbet Qumran? Well, as we talked previously, we do find a rather elaborate system of channels and cisterns and stepped pools at Khirbet Qumran. Some of them, as you can see from this profile, you can step down and out. And some interpret these as ritual baths for a large community, where one would go down into the water and come out ritually pure. And rites of ritual purification and washing are frequent in the Tzerech Yachad and the Damascus document. Also we find at Qumran stone vessels, along with these rather odd jars. These are often called scroll jars because scrolls were found in them, but a scroll is only about the third the size of the jar. It wasn't designed to hold scrolls. As I pointed out previously, notice there are no handles. And the lip, or the opening is very wide. If you had something in there and you were trying to pour it out, it would be extremely awkward to do so and you'd likely spill. But if it's used for dipping, a big opening like that one could dip in, and it would be a way of preserving purity. So that might be indicated by this remains. When we turn to some of the scrolls themselves, especially the Tzerech Yachad, purity is a major issue. No man who suffers from a single type of the uncleanness that affects humanity shall enter their assembly. These are the rules by which the men of holiness shall conduct themselves one with another. And a series of rules follows. If he does proceed in joining the party of the Yachad, he must not touch the pure food of the general membership before they have examined him as to his spiritual fitness and works. And then in the temple scroll, look at some of these restrictions about the temple area and the city surrounding it, as to all those who may not enter. Not the blind, not the unclean, not the leper, not even an unclean bird is to fly over, and keep those latrines a long way from the city. The city that I shall sanctify by establishing my name there must be holy and pure from anything that is unclean, by which one might be defiled. So writes the temple scroll. How different Jesus is. Then he called the crowd to him and said to them, "Listen and understand. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles." And in Mark, he said to them, "Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach? It goes out into the sewer." And the biblical writer adds, "Thus he declared all foods clean." Or in John chapter 15, the vine and branches speech of Jesus. "Every branch that bears fruit he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Not by your ritual washing, not by your following of the Torah, but by the word I have spoken to you. Purity in the Jesus movement. Acts chapter 11, when the representatives of Cornelius are about to come to Peter, he has a vision several times. The voice answers from heaven, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." And through this experience, plus his encounter with Cornelius, Peter has a major aha moment. God shows no partiality. There are not those on the in and on the out. Hebrews, therefore, my friends, since we have confidence to enter the sanctuary, not because we're pure, but by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us approach with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed in pure water. So, these common characteristics of Jewish religion in the late Second Temple period, we see similar language in some of the scrolls and in the movement of Jesus and those who followed him. But we also see some significant differences. And those differences can get fairly significant at some times. John the Baptist, his lineage is similar to those described in the sectarian scrolls, for he is the son of a priest, and they were of priestly descent. The location of John's ministry is in the desert, in the wilderness, prepare the way. But John was further north along the Jordan, and if there was a community at Kirbet Qumran, that's further south along the Dead Sea. Both have an urgent message. The end is at hand. But John invites all to baptism. In the Tzarech Yachad, several years of ritual washing before you're ready to come into the community. And yet both look to the same scriptures, the same prophets, Isaiah, Deuteronomy, Genesis. Here's an interesting piece, 4Q5:21. It's a messianic apocalypse. Line 12 says of the Messiah, "He shall heal the critically wounded. He shall raise the dead and bring good news to the poor." That was the expectation of the community behind this fragment. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus answers the followers of John the Baptist, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." The expectations are similar, but in the case of Jesus, it's a reality, not something hoped for. 4Q256 says of the Messiah, "And he will be called great and designated by his name. Son of God he shall be called, and they shall call him Son of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his ways are truth." How similar that is to the Annunciation. "And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, called Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David." Tzarech Yachad says, "The members shall rebuke one another in truth, humility, and charity. This is the spirit that prevailed when there was a conflict. An offended person is not to hate the offender, but let him rebuke him on the very same day, lest he incur guilt because of him. A person is not to accuse another before the congregation without having first admonished him in the presence of witnesses." This type of admonition we see also talked about in Matthew 18. But now let's look at some real differences. "No one should provoke his servant, his maid, or his worker on the Sabbath. No one should help an animal give birth on the Sabbath. And if it falls into a well or a pit, he may not lift it out on the Sabbath," says the Damascus document. But Jesus says to them, "Suppose one of you has only one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is the human being than a sheep? So it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Similar language again, 4QMMT. We have written to you some of the works of the law, those which should be beneficial to you, because we have seen you possess insight and knowledge of the law. It will be reckoned to you as righteousness, as you have done what is right and good before him. If you recognize some language from Paul, you'll see the language is similar. But Paul, the reckoning of as righteousness is by faith. The War Scroll provides our last major point of comparison. The War Scroll talks about the end of the days, an age of perfection when all the rituals and regulations of the sect will finally be brought into fruition, and the pure will participate in holy convocations with the Levites and the sons of Zadok leading. But a war must take place first between the sons of light and Belial and the sons of darkness. And so the War Scroll talks about how the members of the community are to prepare for and be formed for battle, what banners they should carry, how they should march, how the battles will take place, how there will be 3 wins and 3 losses, and then finally God will come and fight with them in the 7th and final battle, giving them the victory, which will then be followed by an eschatological meal involving the 2 messiahs, the priestly Messiah and the kingly Messiah, the one who led the battle, and these meals are very similar to those that are in the community. The important point is the expectation of this scroll is that the faithful and pure will fight in the last battle. Let's look at what Jesus says about the end. Nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom, the famines, earthquakes, so it's going to be bad at the end. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, there he is, don't believe it, for false messiahs and prophets will appear. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But there's no mention here about the faithful doing the fighting. Similarly, in the book of Revelation, a series of visions, the call is to remain faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. And as one goes through the cycles, the 7 letters, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the unholy Trinity in the Christ, the bowls, the fate of Babylon, and the final judgment, again and again and again, the victory occurs not because the people fight, but because the Lamb is on the throne. A very different perspective about how the end will come about. And the book, of course, ends with this glorious vision of the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. But unlike the great temple, which would be pretty large, this one's 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles on each side, much larger than anything conceived of in the temple scroll. So what is the value of the scrolls ultimately for understanding the Jesus movement? Similar language is used. New covenant. There are messianic expectations that use similar language. Both turn to the prophets for understanding their contemporary circumstance, and both have ritual washings of sort. Jesus lived and died in the Jewish religious world, and so we would expect that language and culture and actions of that world that we see in the scrolls, we would also see in Jesus. But the evidence that I've laid out tonight, I hope, enables you to see how Jesus is on the fringe of the spectrum of Jewish religious groupings in the late Second Temple period. The Sadducees, who controlled the temple, for them, the central truth, the central teaching, were the words of the Torah, especially those regulations about the temple. To the left of the Sadducees were the Pharisees, who made the Torah easier with their oral tradition, the tradition of the elders. But as you know, Jesus and the Pharisees often clashed. Jesus and the Sadducees often clashed. Jesus had a different interpretation of the Torah. I say to you, and it was one that welcomed those on the fringes, that healed those who would have no part in the kingdom. Whereas the Echad, represented by some of the scrolls, is even more strict, further to the right, than the Sadducees and the words of the Torah. So, I've talked tonight about some of my assumptions as I approach this, and I hope I've given you a range of evidence that places Jesus within this Jewish religious world, which we also see the scrolls are part of, but also to help you see there are some distinct differences that are at the heart of the teaching of Jesus. So, thank you very much, and we'd be happy to take your questions. Please.
When and why did the Orthodox Jews discontinue sacrifices?
That was not their choice. The choice was made by the Romans when they destroyed the temple. Or are you talking about when and where did the community reflect it?
Don't practice it now.
No, that's because once the temple was destroyed, you cannot do sacrifices without a temple. Right. So the destruction of the temple in September of 70 AD, that's why the holiest place in Jerusalem for Jews is the Wailing Wall, where people go to pray and mourn the destruction of the temple. This is not a wall of the temple, this is a wall of the platform on which the temple stood, and pray for the day when the Messiah will come and a new temple will be built and sacrifices might resume again. But the sacrifices ceased with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
Before the temple was built, they had sacrifice.
Certainly, with Abraham and Isaac on holy sites like Bethel, the house of God, and so forth. Right, sacrifice was part of the religion of the patriarchs. And then that becomes institutionalized under the law that God gave through Moses, that's recorded in the Torah. And then, of course, was practiced, first of all, in a moving temple called the tabernacle. Then David brought the ark and the tabernacle to his new capital, Jerusalem. Solomon built the first temple. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, 587. Second temple was built, small compared to it, 517 BC, eventually expanded by Herod the Great, and then destroyed by the Romans, and nothing since. Okay. Other questions? Please.
If these scrolls date from before, say, the 1st century BC,
some of them do,
and they reflect priests and maybe some Essenes and others who are dissatisfied with the priesthood,
right?
That means the priests had practice in dealing with people that disagreed with them. And so there's a precedent for their opposition to Jesus, who obviously had his own.
Well, that's assuming that a withdrawal society was precipitated by those who were in power pushing them out. The withdrawal from society, and that there seems to be a withdrawal from society reflected in some of the scrolls, whether it's one group or multiple groups, because the Damascus document talks about communities in the cities and communities in the camps. The Serach Yakad, the rule of the community, talks about whenever 10 are gathered. So it could also be that they walked out because of dissatisfaction. Now, one of the theories is that the teacher of righteousness was one of the last of the Zadokite priests, who was then, when the Hasmoneans, those are the folks who, after the Maccabean revolt, ruled Israel as an independent country, or Judea first and then Galilee eventually, that they when they took over the kingship from the Greeks, they also took control of the temple and threw the teacher of righteousness out. And so Jonathan was the wicked priest because he did that. That's one theory. The problem with that theory is if that's what's supposed to be represented by the archaeology of Qumran, we're almost a century off. So, there's some issues there. But, it could have been pushed out. It could have been withdrawn.
But there's a history of opposition to either the temple leadership or the Pharisees. And so they're ready for Jesus because they kind of developed a modus operandi to operate with people who are dissatisfied with them. Is that a fair assumption?
Well, I think it's more the Romans had a way for dealing with people who caused any kind of awkwardness, especially Pilate. I mean, the first Passover when Pilate was prefect, he comes from Caesarea to Jerusalem, puts his standards at the gates of the temple. There's a huge riot. Lots of Jews are killed. And that sort of establishes how Pilate's going to handle any dissent. And so I would look more to that kind of tension, because the Passover is longing for someone to come and drive these folks out. We see that in the War Scroll. The Kittim will eventually be utterly defeated and dead on the field. And so what happened in the death of Jesus, I interpret it more as a product of Roman action. Of course, the religious authorities are part of it as well. But I'm not sure that I'm ready to say that there was a long-standing way of doing this on the part of the religious authorities. Yeah. Please.
So what are some of the groups that were operating at the time that do have some more similarities to Jesus, like the Essenes, or who should we look to?
Well, I think one of the problems is we only have some Dead Sea scraps here. We have no certain Pharisaic documents, although the Pharisaic tradition is what seems to eventually be reflected in the Mishnah, but that's written 200 years later. We have Josephus, but he's writing in Rome trying to rehabilitate the Jews, so how accurate is his description? So we have bits and pieces and fragments, but I think it's fair to say that our maybe somewhat overly simplistic perspective on the Jewish religious world as Pharisees, Sadducees, and Jesus, I think it was much broader and much more complex than that. That probably even among those major groups, there were subgroups. And we find a whole range of stuff in these scrolls, from like the Tzarech Yachad and the Damascus document, which seem to talk about this group that withdrew. There are some of the documents that may be Sadducean in background. There are other documents that praise the Hasmoneans. It's a very diverse thing. We get some additional glimpses here, and they're great glimpses, but they're only glimpses. What shouldn't surprise us is that we have similar language in the scrolls and in Jesus, because they come out of the same religious world. Well, yeah, the Essenes are referred to primarily by Josephus. There's also reference in Pliny, and I think there's one in Philo also. He has a couple of descriptions of some of the things that they do, and it lines up pretty well with what we see in the Tzarech Yachad, but not on every point. So, and then again, is this, with Josephus, you always have to ask, is this an accurate description, or is this being described this way so it will be appealing to the Romans? He calls these groups philosophy. He says there are 3 philosophies. Well, that's a Roman term. That's not a Jewish term for describing various sects. That help? All right. The question is, are the Dead Sea Scrolls important for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod? There are times when I'd like to see some people in the Synod head out to the wilderness, but and they probably would like to see me head out to the wilderness. In terms of speaking to the particular issues, I mean, they're not authoritative. But what they do is they give us a richer perspective on the religious world of Jesus. We need to remember that Jesus lived in this Jewish religious world. He wasn't a Northern European with blonde hair and blue eyes, despite the Sunday school pictures. And the things that he talked about with his followers in Galilee were issues of observing the Torah. But his approach is different. He does, not one of it will pass away. I say to you.
What you're saying is, historically speaking, about the Jewish religion and the times of the Jewish religion, it's important for our church to know that.
Yes. It's not going to address the neuralgic issues of the Missouri Synod. Okay. I can take 1 or 2 more questions. Please.
Do you have an opinion as to why there are no personal names among all these documents, for instance, the wicked priest, the teacher of righteousness?
Actually, in a couple of documents, there are personal names. There is a reference to Alexander Jannaeus by name. Alexandra Salome is mentioned in one of the documents by name. So there are some. But the big documents, these ones that were discovered initially, that most people have studied, where we have fairly complete documents, those tend to speak in riddles. The teacher of righteousness, the man of the lie. There have been some interesting perspectives on this. This book right here says, The Qumran Origins of the Christian Church, Barbara Thiering from Australia, says that John the Baptist is the teacher of righteousness and Jesus is the man of the lie, and argues that way. No one agrees with her, but she's published a book and you can get it real cheap. Mine was used. Okay, please.
This may be late, but could you repeat the question? It's a real challenge.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not used to doing that. Yeah. People named. Are there any, is it just these sort of euphemisms like teacher of righteousness, man of the lie, or are there people actually named in the scrolls? In some scrolls, there are some characters named, such as Alexander Jannaeus, who was one of the Hasmonean kings, Alexander Saloma, who was a Hasmonean queen for a period of time. There are some that are named. Yeah. And these are in the sectarian documents. Of course, when you get into the apocryphal documents and the Hebrew Bible documents, you get all sorts of people named, but just in this sectarian group. In the back, please.
So, do you think that there are lines of influence that lead more or less directly from these documents to then the time of Jesus and John the Baptist and Jesus, or are the similarities and differences more, could they be more attributed to the fact that they're both?
The question is, are the similarities and is there a direct connection between the scrolls and the Jesus movement? No. But they both come out of the same period of Jewish religion. And so what I'm trying to illustrate is they use a lot of the same language. They have some similar expectations, even down to words like the Messiah, who'll be called Son of the Most High, raise the dead. They have similar expectations. But that's because they're both Jews, not because one came from the other. And last question, because I promised 8:30. Please.
Have they gone through all of the scrolls now? I mean, have they been pretty much documented what's there,
Okay.
or are there still ones to be...
Actually, we're moving into the second period of scroll scholarship, where all these little scroll fragments, 931, 11 or 12 of them are whole scrolls, or others are just parts of scrolls. And that's what you will see when you go to the exhibition. You'll see 5 parts. And those now have all finally been published. And so we're now in the period where another generation of scholars can look at these fragmentary documents and search for more parallels and try to build theories on how they relate, if they relate. I suspect, again, I think the running rebels theory makes the best sense. They're just a bunch of documents from a bunch of different individuals and groups fleeing the Romans, who stuck them in the safest place they could, caves near the Dead Sea, because that was the remotest place they could go. Thank you all for being part of this series. Those of you who came to more than one of them, we hope this encourages you to see the exhibition at the Science Museum. My students certainly enjoyed it the other night when we went there. They do a very nice job of handling some of the debate. I took a stand on some of those things. They don't take stands. They say there's this position and this position. It starts at the very beginning. The first room you walk into, there are people quoted on the same wall that I know wouldn't be in the same room together because they disagree so much. So that in itself was interesting. So please enjoy the exhibition, and thank you so much for being part of it.